Welcome, everybody, to our next session. I hope you enjoyed Coffee and Bagel and spent some time talking with other attendees and some of our ProLinkers. We'll be randomly selecting one participant as a winner for a $50 Starbucks gift card. The winner will be receiving an email from us in just a few minutes, so be sure to be on the lookout for that. At the end of the day, we'll be displaying all of our Coffee and Bagel winners on the conference homepage, similar to how we did yesterday. The session you have just entered now is Configuring Dev for Home and New Funding Programs with Kelly Encinas, HFA Senior Product Manager for ProLink Solutions. This session has an intermediate difficulty level. Before we start the session, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Similar to yesterday and all of our other sessions, but a friendly reminder if you haven't been here before, on the right side of your screen, you'll see a chat feature. Just click on the chat icon and you can begin chatting with your fellow attendees. Feel free to post any comments or questions throughout the session in the chat, and we'll try to provide responses or any follow-ups individually. Please note that all of your posts are visible to all other attendees. Also on the right side of your screen, you'll have access to a poll feature below the chat feature. Throughout this session, poll questions will be displayed one by one. You'll have about 30 seconds to answer each poll question, after which they'll be closed and we'll display the results on screen. And now I would like to hand things over to Kelly. So Kelly, if you can begin screen sharing, please.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alexis. Let me share my screen. I want screen 2 and share. Alexis, confirm for me that you can see my screen, okay?
Yes, I can see it's the PowerPoint and then, yep, the slideshow.
Okay, there we go. So let's talk first about agenda and what we're going to cover today. So we're talking all about home and other funding sources within your dev deals. So that's really where we're going to focus. Some of you might recognize that earlier this year in our ProLink HFA webinar series, we did talk about, we did do a session for home funding. We did do a session for other funding sources. And so this might be a little bit similar. I'm just trying to fix my video here a little bit because I think I look funny. Oh, and it won't come back on. Yikes. Okay, I might not be able to come. There I am. Whoops. Okay. Anyways, we did those sessions earlier this year. And so you might recognize some of the topic areas. You might recognize some of the content. I am going to try to go a little bit deeper here this morning, today, for you. And so know that, those webinars and the content for those are available. And if you want those, please, reach out to Alexis or Sam or myself or anybody at ProLink, and we can get you pointed in that direction. Okay. So once we talk about funding sources within our dev deals, then we'll talk about what we call fiscal year allocation tracking. That's being able to track the annual home and other program funds, annually, right? Like what's our spend? Where are we at? How many deals did we fund? That kind of thing. And then we'll take a look at reporting on your home and your other funding sources within your dev deals. And for that, we'll turn our attention to data views there. So let's go ahead and dive into home and funding sources in your dev deals. So a lot of you probably have been with me before and you're kind of a little bit accustomed to how I operate. I like to not stay so much in the slide deck, but I like to go live in the system. And so that's mainly what we're going to do here this morning, today. I keep saying this morning because it's morning for me, but some of you are already into the afternoon. But before we dive into the system, let's do a poll question, okay? So our first poll question: How recently have you started a new program, a new funding program at your agency? Has that been in the last 1 to 3 years, in the last 3 to 5 years, in the last 5 to 7, or maybe not since you've been at the agency, or you don't know? So Alexis, go ahead and put up our poll, and we'll have about 30 seconds to answer that question, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at the results there about starting new programs in your agencies. I don't have music like Sarah does. I apologize. Okay, and it looks like Sam's got some results there for us. So let's take a look. So about, well over half of you have started new funding programs in your agency in the last 1 to 3 years. Um, some don't know, and that's okay because you might not be involved. So, makes this the fact that, we've got that full 61% of you, makes this topic that much more, um, you know, valuable to us. Before we dive in, I want to talk for just a minute about HUD, right? Because HUD brings us our home funding, right? They bring us a boatload of other programs, right? CDBG, NSP, and the like. The things that I really want to kind of focus on here in terms of some of these facts is the fact that HUD's mission statement is to promote inclusive, sustainable communities and affordable housing. So, that bodes well for us, right? That's the business that we're in. Although we are seeing some pretty drastic changes currently in terms of affordable housing funding, because that is their mission statement. Again, I think that bodes well for us. Another item that I want to kind of draw your attention to is that their core focus areas, right? Affordable housing, right? Again, homelessness assistance, fair housing enforcement, community development, disaster recovery. All of those things speak to what your agencies are doing, and again, bode well for us. So, despite a lot of changes that we're seeing right now, I know that it looks very different for the future. I think this holds great prospect for us in the industry that we're in. Okay. So let's really dive in now. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of that slide deck, and I'm going to go live into the system here. So I'm in my HFA demo environment here, and I am going to start out in what we call my dev activities. And I need to keep my slide deck open here so that I don't miss any talking points with you. So where I'm starting out here is with what we call my dev activities. Now, some of you may be familiar, some of you may be not. So let's talk about what is my dev activities, right? This is the landing page that you might possibly be assigned within ProLink HFA, okay? So what do I mean by landing page? That means that each time that you access the system, whether you are going through the login screen or whether you have single sign-on, you have a landing page assigned to you, okay? And that comes to you via your security role in the system. We won't go into that detail today because we don't have time. However, you do have a landing page. If you're involved in, development deals, tax credit deals, you might have my dev activities as your landing screen. You might have my TCA activities if your sole focus is tax credit. And then, of course, if you're really involved in asset management, maybe your landing screen is my AM activities. Regardless, for those of you who are pretty heavily involved in your development deals, probably my dev activities is your landing screen, okay? And so this is a listing of active deals in the system. And you can see that I currently have my view grouped by my stage. And so I'm seeing the active deals that are in the system grouped by the stage. Okay. And so I can collapse and expand those stages and whatnot. Note as well that in this header area of my screen, I do have additional filtering capability. Okay. So, if you drop into your system and you're not necessarily seeing the exact same view that I'm showing you, please check that filtering that you have going, and you might have some of your filters set differently, okay? But we can use my development activities to access the active deals within our system. Please remember as well that as you look to your left navigation menu, you've also got your recently visited list, okay? This is going to give you that listing of the items that you have, I think it's the last 10 items that you've most recently accessed within the system. Okay. So for me, you can see that I was working on Peachtree, Breezy Lane, dev deals. I was working on Garden Court property, so asset management and the like. Okay. So that recently visited list is a fabulous tool to always be able to return to and work on those dev deals or those properties that I might be most focused on right now. Okay. Also, I can click through into one of these rows that's listed here in my development activities. So let's go ahead and drop into Breezy Lane Townhomes and take a look at this development deal. And let's look at, funding sources and what that looks like. But before we do that, I want to take us into our edit deal screen. And the reason that I'm coming here is because I want to talk for a minute about our deal fiscal year. Okay. Based on how we configure our funding programs within the system and how we might be able to best report on these funding programs has a lot to do with the fiscal year of our deal. Okay. So if we want to have this ability to report, in our most current versions of our funding programs, we want our deals that are using our funding programs to have a latest and greatest deal fiscal year. Okay. So for the purposes of our demonstration today, I'm actually going to update this deal fiscal year for my Breezy Lane townhomes to 2025. Okay. Because that's the reporting examples that we'll look at here together today. Now, likely when I change that field, I do need to click the save button in my top toolbar to save that change. For most of you likely who are putting your dev deals into the system today, that deal fiscal year, because that is a required field, and we know that that's required because it's marked with that red asterisk on the label, okay? Because that is a required field on our deal, very likely that is coming into your deal and being populated from your funding application. Okay, so the likelihood that you're really going to have to go in and edit your deal fiscal year is probably pretty low. Okay, but I like to point that out for people and just notate in your minds that that deal fiscal year is really pretty critical, and it can really help drive the reporting that you might want to be doing, in your home and your other funding sources. Okay. So that's I want to highlight that first before we really dive into a funding source. So let's take a look now at actually adding a funding source to a dev deal. Okay, so as I kind of move down my left navigation menu here, I'm coming into deal funding. Okay, Again, deal funding is where, and you can see I haven't added any funding sources to my particular dev deal yet, but this is where you're going to be adding and detailing all of the funding sources, right? The sources, right, that are likely coming out of, again, your funding application, right? So for those of you who are using a funding application today and are using that with Smart Docs, right? This type of information is added to the system automatically for you when you do that Smart Docs send, okay? Um, and it's possible to the degree that some of you may not even be familiar with adding a funding source manually, and that's okay. We're going to walk through that together today, but recognize that the funding sources that are being reported in your funding application, those are, probably typically again added to the system through that Smart Docs send from your funding application, right? And well, they should be, right? Because as we see deals today, there can be upwards of 12, 14, 15 funding sources that we're talking about, right? To try to put these deals together. And that would be a lot of manual data entry. Not that it couldn't be done, but it's just a lot more convenient to have that happen through that Smart Docs funding application, right? And as well, think about the implication there, right? This is a developer, an applicant submitting this information, and we want to remove those possibilities for error in data entry. And so when we use that Smart Docs tool, right, to push that data in, we take away one of those points where, we could possibly fat finger some of that information. So, but let's walk through this manually just so that we get the feeling and we see what it looks like in adding these funding sources into a dev deal. So you saw, let me go back and just point out what I did here. So I'm on my deal funding and I'm going to click new in the top toolbar. That gives me a new funding source record, okay? So the first item that I need to choose here, and this is really what we're talking about, is my funding source. And again, notice that that funding source field is marked with that red asterisk. So that means that in order for me to save this funding source record, I have to choose the funding source, okay? So the first example that we'll look at here is a funding source that we have that's called home rental development. Your agency probably has a home funding source for your dev deals. It can be named in whatever way that your agency chooses, right? We'll take a look here a little bit later on at how we create the sources that we see that are available for us in this drop-down list, okay? So we're going to choose home rental development. I am going to go ahead and also choose my program type, and I've got that indicating as the same as my funding source. It's just my home rental development. And then I'm going to go ahead and enter an amount, okay? So this amount, if we think about this, again, typically this is coming from our funding application, right? So that amount is, what is the amount of home rental development source that this particular deal is asking for. Okay, so that's entering that amount. And then I need to click save in my top toolbar to actually save this funding source onto my dev deal. Okay, so now if I go back out to my listing of my dev deal, I can see, okay, I've got my home funding source listed there. Now, let's talk about funding sources and what this maybe looks like for you and for your agency and for the dev deals that you're tracking in the system. Your agency might be tracking that entire capital stack that comes in on that funding source, on that funding application, right? That means all of the sources that are required to make this deal go, right? You may be tracking every single one of those funding sources, okay? Some of you might be doing that. Some of you might be tracking just the funding sources that are coming from your agency, okay? And so what I mean by that is that your funding application likely requires the entire funding stack, right? Because that you need that in order to be able to do true underwriting. But within ProLink HFA itself, you may only track the funding sources that your agency is going to be supplying to this particular deal, this particular project. Whichever way your agency chooses to do that is completely fine. It's just a matter of what you're able to do in terms of the resources that you have available for this tracking and reporting. Okay. The system can accommodate either way. Okay. So know and recognize, excuse me, that your list of funding sources per deal may only include those, 2, 3, 4 sources that are coming from your agency, or it may include those 12 to 15 that define that entire capital stack that is required by that deal. Okay. So you can see how we add that home funding source. Now let's go back in and let's look at adding another funding source, right? So home, right? That's a federal funding source that my agency is given the responsibility for dispersing that money. You might also have programs, funding sources that are sourced either, specifically by your agency or are, again, assigned to your agency by your state legislature, right? And so you may have those other programs, those other funding sources that you're needing to add into these deals. And so it really looks the same, right? And so what is the program type for those other sources that might be coming in? Okay. Could be an amortized loan, could be a forgivable loan, could be a grant program, or it could be some other program, right? And so recognize too that that program drop down list there, that's controlled by your agency, right? You can build out that list of program types to be what are applicable to your agency, to the funding sources that you're supplying into these deals or these projects. Okay. Again, we want to list an amount. Let's do 1.5 million here, and let's do a save and return. So we then see we've got 2 funding sources now that we've added to this deal. Okay. And so again, remember, most of you who work with your dev deals today, you probably are not adding these funding sources manually like this, right? Again, those are coming into your deal through that send action that you do in SmartDocs through that funding application, okay? And that's fine, but I like to show you what that looks like, just a little bit different experience within the system, okay? So that's adding these different types of funding sources, whether they're federal or state or agency specific, okay? So let's talk about next, how do I get these funding sources added into my system as I click back into these? How do I get that funding source that I need added into this drop-down list so that I can start using those in my dev deals? That's where we'll head next. But before we do that, let's go ahead and do another poll question. So poll question number 2 here. Are all of your funding programs currently tracked within ProLink HFA? Your choices here are 100% of my funding programs are tracked within ProLink HFA, 75, 50, 25, or maybe none. So Sam, go ahead and put that poll up. We'll give you about 30 seconds here to answer that question. And then we'll take a look at kind of what's going on across the country. Are folks using ProLink HFA to track some or all of their funding programs? Okay. Again, sorry that I don't have the cool music that Sarah always has at her presentations. I need to work on that, right, guys? I need to up my game a little bit. Okay, I think it's been about 30 seconds. So let's see if we can get those answers into our slide deck here. And let's go ahead and take a look at those. So it's about equally divided, 30, 30, 30, as to all your programs being tracked, 75%, 50%, okay? Well, let's take a look at how we can kind of up that 100% number. Let's look at that together, okay? So again, let's go live into the system, but let's talk about how do I get these funding programs into ProLink HFA so that I can track these within my deals, okay? How do I get that funding source added into that drop down, okay? So the way to do that is through what we call funding sources. And the way to access our funding sources is within our utilities panel. So if I look to my left navigation menu, I'm clicking into my utilities panel. Now, I want to point out to you that for those of you who are using ProLink HFA today, you may not see the utilities panel in your left navigation menu, okay? And that's okay. That's because the access and visibility to this utilities panel is controlled by our security privileges, okay? And so your role that you're assigned within the system may not give you access to that panel. And that's okay. Honestly, it kind of means that you have a little bit fewer responsibilities, maybe, so it kind of means less work, so it's all right. However, if you feel like you're someone within your organization that needs access here, this is something that you take to your ProLink administrators and you talk this through with them and say, listen, I need access because I want to be able to add funding sources to the system so that they can be utilized by my team, okay? And if you need help with that, if you need help starting that conversation, or how to talk about that within your organization, reach out to us. We can help facilitate kind of those conversations and those planning meetings, okay? So you'll notice within my dev folder, right, within my dev section there, I'm clicking into funding sources. So let's talk about this for a minute because this is a little bit different concept. So if you'll recall, remember when we were in our deal and we were in our deal funding, we had funding sources as a drop-down list, right? There was a listing of all sorts of values there that I could choose from. This funding sources menu option within this utilities panel is how we build the values that appear within that drop down, okay? And so let's talk about that for a minute because that is a little bit different, right? Think about all the other drop downs that we see throughout the screens within the system. We typically call those pick lists, right? And the way that we build those lists and manage and maintain those is within our admin panel within our pick lists functionality, right? So this funding sources is a little bit different. It's kind of what you might think of as more of like a custom pick list, okay? And it allows us to build out these different funding sources that are needed within the system, okay? And so kind of think about too this idea that funding sources, this maintenance is available within our utilities panel versus our admin panel. And so that kind of talks to us about this idea that the maintenance and the administration of our funding sources, this can be a different member of our agency than, our kind of our typical ProLink administrator, right? The folks that we might see that are having access and needing to maintain our funding sources is more folks that we think of like program managers, right? That kind of person. Okay. So again, we come into our funding sources. When we arrive here, we can see a listing of all the funding sources that are available within the system. Okay. Now I want to note for you that this listing, this view of our funding sources is actually a data view, okay? So we have all the same kind of functionality that's available to us in all of our data views that we see in our data views panel, right? So we can build views to see, different versions of, listing of our funding sources. We've got our in-grid filtering button and the like in our top toolbar, okay? We've got export functionality and the like, okay? And I wanna note for you that as I'm visiting here on my funding sources list screen, I've got my in-grid filtering turned on, okay? And I am filtered down to look at just the active funding sources, okay, that are within my system. So, think about that implication. Maybe I have a new funding source, a new program that I, build out in the system. And, every funding source has a limit, right, to the amount of funds that are available. And so, maybe there's a funding source that's only available for a few years, right? And so in that scenario, for that couple years, I would have that as an active funding source so that, my development officers, my production group, they have that funding source available on the deal in the funding source or in the funding application to add to the deals. And then when that funding runs out, when those dollars are dispersed, then I inactivate that funding source so that people aren't mistakenly trying to use that, right, in new deals that are coming into the pipeline. Okay. And so that's the reason for that, being able to mark those sources as active or inactive. Okay. So let's take a look at adding actually a brand new funding source, right? So I click new in the top toolbar. That's going to open up a new record for me. And I can create a brand new funding source, okay? Let's call this 2025 ProLink Tech Live funding source, okay? I give that name there. Now, obviously that funding source name, because it's marked with that red asterisk, right? That's required. I've got to supply that in creating this new funding source record. I want you to note as well that the source type is also required in order for me to be able to save this new funding source, okay? And I want to direct you to please use other as your source type, okay? Now, let's talk about why, and let's talk about these other values and the curiosity that this may bring for you. Particularly when you're adding a new either agency funding program or even, something that's coming through your state legislature. Your instinct might be to select that source type of internal, right? Particularly when this is an agency funded program. You might say to yourself, this is internal. This is where I should go. Don't go here. The reason that I want you to stay away from using that internal source type is because there's some built-in functionality when you use that internal source type that kind of bundles that funding source in your dev deals. And that bundling happens when you start doing draws and dispersing your draws. And so what happens is all the sources that you might have in a particular deal, they're bundled into a grouping that's called HFA funds. And that's what you use as the sources in your draws, okay? Which that's fine. If you don't need to track this source or some other source at a granular level in your draw disbursements, then you can use that internal source type. But when you've got federal funds, home or others, these programs need to be tracked at a granular level in disbursement in your draws, then I need you to choose other, okay? And so I'll take us back into a deal here in a minute and we'll look at a draw and I'll show you the difference between when you choose a source type of other versus external, and how that works in sourcing those draws. But the point that I want you to get from this, if you get nothing else, is when you are creating these dev funding sources, please use other, and that's going to give you the granularity that you might need. Okay. Now, another item that I want to stress for you is to mark that active checkbox. Okay. That's going to be the difference. Marking that active checkbox or forgetting about that is going to make this funding source appear in your funding sources drop down in your deals. Okay. If active is deselected, it's not going to appear in that drop down. Okay. It's not going to populate into your smart docs mapped funding applications. Okay. So make sure that you make that active checkbox selection when you're creating a new funding source. Okay. You also are going to want to mark HFA dispersed. Now, let's talk about this for a minute too. As you're creating these funding sources, this is going to, whether or not you select HFA dispersed, this is going to depend on the level that you're tracking those funding sources. So remember how I talked about, you can track all the sources in the deal, or you can track just the sources that are being supplied by your agency, right? If you're tracking everything, you want to mark HFA dispersed, right? Because that's going to help you again in actually dispersing those sources out in your draws, okay? And then marking HFA monies, that lets you know, that gives you that distinction, that reporting ability between those other new funding programs that might be coming from your agency, right? Might be sourced from your agency, or those other funding programs that might be sourced through your state legislature, okay? Marking HFA money says this is my agency's particular program, and not a federal source, versus, again, you might have those, coming from your state legislature, that's your state funds, not federal, but not your agency's funds. Okay. Gives you that granularity. Okay. So that is that simple, right? Adding a funding source like that. Pretty relatively straightforward. If I do kind of a save and return and I go back to my larger list of all my active funding sources, I can see there now I've got my 2025 ProLink Tech Live funding source. Okay. And that might be as far as I go in terms of configuration of a new funding source, okay? I just might stop there and say, okay, this is good enough. I've got this funding source available now. Let's go look at this in a deal. I can include this funding source now in my dev deals. I can map this thing now. Well, it'll already be mapped. I just need to do a refresh in my funding application, right? I can add this funding source now via my Smart Docs funding application. And I'm ready to go. I can include this source now in my deals, and this may be all that I need to do, okay? So let me click into my deal funding now. And let me click new because I want to add a new funding source. And so now I can see there's my 2025 ProLink Tech Live funding source. I'm going to choose a program type. Let's say that this is a grant. And maybe from this, maybe let's say it's 850 is my amount. Okay. So I can add that now as a funding source to my deal. So literally, if you have a new program that's coming on, you can spin this up in your ProLink HFA system that quickly and start using that in your deals, okay? Now, let's talk though in a little bit more detail about, okay, I've added this funding source into the system. It's there now. I can, if I've got a Smart Docs mapped funding application, I can do a refresh drop downs action right in my funding application. That source is going to be available now for my developer to choose as some sourcing that they might want. So I've got that going, right? Now, how can I track what's happening with this program, with this funding source in the system? How can I see the deals that are requesting and or using that source? How can I report on the deals that are receiving funding from that particular program or that funding source? Okay. So there are a couple of different ways that we can do this tracking and this reporting for this or any or all of our funding sources. So let's look at option number one. I'm going to come back into my utilities panel, and I'm going to come into my fiscal year allocation tracking. Okay, so again, it's in my dev folder here. It's right under my funding sources. Okay. I can click into this menu option. Again, what we see here is a listing of allocation tracking records that we've built in the system. Okay. Again, this is a data view. So you can see I've got my in-grid filtering turned on. I can create different views. You can see I've got a lot built out here by fiscal year, right? Because that's how I want to look at the tracking of these programs, right? So in order to track these given funding sources that I might have set up in the system, I can build these year over year allocation tracking records. Okay, so I can see I've already built out a 2025 tracking for my home rental development. Okay, so in building this record, what I do is I create the new record, I select from that funding source, right, that I built in my funding sources, and I indicate the fiscal year, okay? So remember how I talked about earlier that fiscal year field on our deal, okay? That fiscal year field on the deal along with this fiscal year on my funding source tracking, this is what kind of glues those together and lets me see year over year how my deals are using my different funding sources. Remember, this is option one, okay? Now, the other thing, a couple more things that this allocation tracking functionality gives me is number one, I can establish here in my current fiscal year budget amount, I can establish what I have available from this program or from this source for this given fiscal year, right? So for 2025, I've got just a little over 10 million available in my home rental development, okay? This helps me track, visually, right? Where I'm at with this particular funding source, right? And we'll look at this here. Well, let's look at it now. So if I click into my Dev Deal Funding Sources tab, this is showing me overall, here are the deals that are requesting funding from this particular source, okay? And remember, I might be building these sources might be federal or state or agency specific. It doesn't matter. I can track whatever I want to, okay? But this shows me the deals that are using funding from, or at least requesting funding from this particular source for the fiscal year, okay? And how do we understand this concept of the deals requesting versus the deals actually using, right? If we look at the stage of all these deals, none of these are in dispersing yet. So really, these are all just requesting at this point, right? And then if I look at the bottom here, I get a total of what's being requested, okay? And so then if I come back to my source info tab, that's where that allocated amount, that's where that $4 million is coming from, is that's reporting to me that I've got, what did I have? I've got 9 deals that are in total requesting 4 million out of the 10 million that I have for my home program for 2025. Okay. Now, again, I can do this for any and all of the sources that I'm creating in my funding sources across the years, right? So, I could come into, here's another, program, a new program funding source, right? Again, same concept. This new program that I have, right? And maybe this is something that's specifically funding that's coming through my own agency. I've got 4.5 available for, this is set up for 2023. That's fine. I've used 600,000 so far. And again, I get that Dev Deal funding sources tab that shows me the different deals that are requesting from this particular source. Okay. So again, this is available within this fiscal year allocation tracking within my utilities panel. Okay. And again, I wanna stress for you, I'm gonna click back to the big list. This is optional. You do not have to set up allocation tracking records if you don't want to, or you don't have the resources, whatever the scenario. You don't have to do this for your funding programs, okay? You can simply add those funding sources, right? In that funding sources menu. They're gonna be available for you to use in your deals. And that may be as far as you get, maybe the first time that you try this, the first time that you try tracking like a new agency or state level program, right? You just might include it as a funding source and okay, we're doing it. But how else can I track and look at these different funding sources that I've got? How can I tell for a given funding source what I've used? How can I tell what deals are being funded by this program? I can simply use data views, okay, to do that. And so that's where we're going to head next. Let's go take a look at our data views and see how we can do that tracking without having to use that allocation tracking mechanism that's available in my utilities panel. But before we go there, let's do our third and final poll question. So this is poll question number 3. How do you track and report funding sources that are not included in ProLink HFA right now? Do you track those in spreadsheets, maybe Excel workbooks? Are you doing that with other software? Is it written down in someone's notebook? And so then that's a little bit more tricky reporting, right? Is there some other mechanism that you're using? Or maybe we don't even know how we're tracking that. So Alexis and Sam, go ahead and put up that poll question for us, and let's give our audience about 30 seconds to answer that question for us. And then once we get those answers back, we'll take a look at kind of what folks are doing when they're not tracking in ProLink HFA. Okay. I think it's probably been close to 30 seconds. So let's see if let's take a look at what we've got here. So it looks like more than half of you, for the programs that you're not tracking within ProLink HFA, you're tracking in spreadsheets. And listen, look at that number, more than half of you, that's typical, right? When you're not tracking it in ProLink HFA, a spreadsheet is your next best option, right? That's probably what you have available, okay? So let's go ahead, and that's not surprising, right? That's, sometimes we don't have, the resources to be able to track these programs within the system. And so a big part of what I'm hoping to encourage you to do today is use ProLink HFA, right? It's, you can see I've shown you how to add that funding source, right? We're going to take a look at our data views now. I've come into our data views panel. We can create data views that look very similar, if not identical, to the spreadsheets that you're using to do that tracking mechanism today. Okay. So I would mention to you that, the biggest maybe step in adding a new funding source, a new funding program into ProLink HFA might be in getting it included in your funding application, right? So, there's layers of that, right? Are you pulling funding sources in through your funding application? If you're not, it's quick enough, right, to add that funding record to the dev deal. If you are adding those funding sources through your funding application, it's literally, like I said, a quick action within that funding application to update the drop downs to include that new funding source. Okay. And so again, I encourage you wholeheartedly, if you want to get some of those programs out of those spreadsheets and into ProLink HFA, but you need some guidance just on how to get started, please reach out to us. That's what we're here for. We're here to help you utilize the system to its utmost capabilities. And so please don't hesitate to reach out, if this is something that you want to take a look at. Okay. So we've just got a few minutes left here today with our configuring our dev funding sources in ProLink HFA. So let's take a look at data views. Okay. So you can see I've come into my data views panel, and I am focusing again within my dev folder, within my dev category. And where I'm going to take a look today is in my deal funding. So I click into my deal funding data view. So remember, this is kind of option 2 for how can I keep track of these funding sources, whether federal, state, or my own agency. I can do that with data views, okay? I want to point out to you that I've got a little bit of information available in the slide deck that just gives you some quick tips and tricks on creating your own views here within a data view. Okay. We don't have time to go through that today, but I did want to include that for you. So, right now, I'm looking at my home funding reporting view, right? This is a view that I've created in my demonstration environment. And what this does is it lets me look at deals in my system that are using my home rental development funding source. Okay. So let's look at the view manager for just a minute and take a look at how am I getting this view to show me just this funding source. So here's my home funding reporting. This is a public view, right? So I'm not going to be able to edit this thing, but I can simply build a data view that does this filtering that says the source name is equal to whatever my funding source is, right? So whatever the funding source is, it doesn't matter. I am filtering this data view to show me this particular funding source. Okay. So, okay, great. I've kind of got this part down. I'm looking at everything that's using my home rental development, right? I want to include the amount, right? And remember that within my data views here at the bottom, I can do that totaling, right? So I can see that, okay, for my home rental program, I'm using $4 million, right? And then I can turn on my in-grid filtering and I can say, hey, I want to look at this year by year. So I'm already filtered to 2025 for my deal fiscal year. So this view right here in my view that I'm calling my home funding reporting, this gives me that same view that I was seeing in that allocation tracking utility, right? This is showing me 2025 for my home rental development program. At this point, I'm at 4 million in terms of usage. Okay. So again, I can do that. Let's look at another example. Here's my new program funding tracking, right? I've got programs that I've called new program. And I've got round one and round two. Okay. So again, I can look at what are the deals that are being funded or at least requesting funding, right? From that given funding source, regardless of what it is, right? It doesn't matter whether it's federal or it's my very own agencies. And what are the amounts? And you can see that when I do that grouping by that source name, remember that I can do that total in that grouping row, right? So that kind of tan row is telling me for my new program funding source for round one at this point, I've got deals requesting 2.2 million. Okay. So again,
Kelly, we do need to wrap up right now, and I just want to give our attendees one little side note.
okay,
So if I could take over screen sharing really quickly,
yep,
and if anybody
go
has
ahead.
any questions or anything, they can definitely reach out to Kelly directly or us at marketing, and we'll be able to get any of your questions or give you more of information of what Kelly was going to provide. So.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alexis. Thanks, everybody. Holler if you have questions. We're here.
And this slide deck will be fully available as well as a reminder. Really quickly, I want to encourage everybody to go into our coffee and bagel discussion for your chance to win a $50 Starbucks gift card. You'll have until about 1:45 p.m. Eastern time to take a break, talk, discuss amongst your fellow employees, possibly even talk to Kelly and get some more information there. When you click on the discussions tab, you'll be able to enter rooms. They can accommodate 6 people, or you can create your own room and have others join you. So please take a moment to meet and greet. Our next session is going to begin at 1:45 with Jessica Britton doing a portfolio property data update utility training. So we hope to see you guys there and hope to talk to you in some coffee and bagel discussions. Thank you for joining.